Welcome back to the show. We're about to learn the secret sauce. Anjana, welcome to our studio.
Thank you.
And
excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to come out all the way from San Francisco.
Such a journey.
Using public transportation too, as well.
Yeah, trying to, save where we can. But yeah, no, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And so setting the stage for folks who haven't watched one of these before, we talk about open source. Really, it's kind of the journey that we're sort of building a product around and talking about your open source journey. And I reached out to you because I saw a tweet of you sort of celebrating, I think it was like a milestone for Outreachy. You had done Outreachy. I want to talk about how you got to Outreachy, but sort of we can start with like your background, philosophy degree.
Yeah. So I went to school actually here in the Bay Area at Cal, got a philosophy bachelor's, also studied foreign languages and French and things like that. So humanities degree. I tried a computer science class for a couple of weeks
at
Berkeley, and I found that it wasn't, it was like a self-paced class. I didn't really know what I was going to use it for. I just thought it was interesting, and it wasn't as exciting as some of the, modern philosophy classes that I wanted to take. So at the time I kind of tried it out really briefly, like wrote like 2 lines of scheme or something and then gave up. But later I ended up, after graduating, I became an English as a foreign language teacher. And so I was studying linguistics on my own to sort of understand language acquisition better, understand how to be a better language teacher, a better language student, because I love learning foreign languages too, and ultimately ended up going back to school to do a master's in a field that I did not know existed until I did a master's in it, called computational linguistics.
Okay. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, sure. So computational linguistics is kind of this big umbrella term that refers to a lot of things that sit at the intersection of computing and human natural language. So
that seems very in vogue nowadays with the AI machine learning.
Yeah, so tons of natural language processing, tons of speech recognition or speech synthesis, like natural language understanding, all of these things, all of these technologies that you'd need to build like a Siri or an AI a chat assistant or anything that's like
chat
AI.
GPT.
I guess so. Anything that's kind of like AI. Yeah, these really successful language models, like that sort of work, it falls under the umbrella of computational linguistics, and as well as essentially doing linguistics, which is the scientific study of human language in a computational methodological way. So using, like, let's say studying big corpora and crunching the numbers to figure out how language works, as opposed to, let's say, just sitting back in an armchair and thinking, well, this is how my language works, so I bet language all works that way, which is not.
Okay, so you went from philosophy to something that's actionable.
Yeah, and so I was really interested in speech technology, so I was studying speech technology, especially for language learning or language teaching applications, let's say, so like computer-assisted pronunciation training and things like that. But in any case, I had to do a lot of coding to get through this program and to do my research in linguistics. I was trying to implement, algorithms from other people's papers that they'd published, or trying to develop small apps to kind of test some of the hypotheses that we were forming, that sort of thing. And so was learning how to code kind of in fits and starts here and there. Didn't really know better than to try a bunch of different languages all at the start. And so I was doing a little bit of Python, a little bit of Groovy and JVM stuff, a little bit of a tiny smattering of JavaScript maybe here and there, but mostly Python, I guess, at the time. And I found that I really loved writing the software I needed to do my research.
Structured learning except the one course?
There was a course, that we had to do as part of the master's program that I took, which I went to school in Germany for that. And we had like one dedicated programming course in Python, which was really useful. I learned like object-oriented Python. That stood me in good stead for what ended up being then my first couple of jobs were in Python. But at the same time, I was learning a lot just kind of by poking at things or just writing a lot of code that, I'm sure now I would go back and read and have feelings about, but just kind of trying to get things to work here and there. And I found that kind of in the academic context where I started learning to code, there were a lot of things that I now know were missing that I didn't at the time know were supposed to be there, like things like version control for a project that people at the department are all going to be working on together, or things like being able to read someone else's published work and go look up their source code on GitHub, right? Like that is amazing for science when you can actually see not just the answer that they got, but like the work that how they calculated those numbers, that sort of thing. So I became really interested in those type of things. So sort of the open research vibe, the idea of like, let's put all of our code up on GitHub, let's train the department and the research assistants in like version control. And so like, this is how I kind of got started with all of that. And it just seemed really interesting to me. Like, how do people actually build huge software programs? Because I'm pretty sure it can't be that like all of the code is on that one doctoral student's laptop and it's just a messy mess of like completely obfuscated variable names and 1,000-line methods. And like, this can't be how like real software developers write software, right? So I sort of was having that feeling of I need to go somewhere and like really learn this like software thing because it's cool and seems like I could learn it better. Yeah.
What year was this that you were sort of having the discovery, went back and got your master's?
Yeah, this was, so I did a master's from I think 2012 to 2015. Okay. So this was probably around like 2013, 2014, I started being more and more interested in software. And that's around the time, I think it was like beginning of 2015, maybe, I found out about this cool place called, well, then it was called Hacker School, and now it's called the Recurse Center. So that is what I kind of, when I took the leap from getting out of academia and trying to get a foot in the door in the industry.
Yeah. Recurse is still around. They're still operating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so.
Do you want to explain what's the structure and how you obviously went through it? So like, what did you learn through it?
Yeah. So the Recurse Center, which you can read all about at recurse.com, is a really awesome, I think of it as a programming community, like a community for people who are interested in code and interested in computer science. And they sometimes call it a programming retreat. So they run this, it used to be in person in New York. Now I believe it's virtual still since the pandemic. But the idea is that it's sort of like a writer's retreat, but for programmers. So anybody can go there at any stage of their coding journey. The idea is that you do already know how to code, but you don't necessarily have been doing it long. You aren't necessarily a professional or anything like that. And then other people have been coding professionally as software engineers or higher for decades, and they come back there. And so everybody is there in a very unstructured, self-directed environment. So there are no classes, there's no curriculum, there's no teachers. There are only a bunch of really excited people who are there eager to learn about their own particular curiosities. So everybody is following their own path. So maybe one person is like, I want to learn Rust. Another person is, I want to figure out how to, write 8-bit games in assembly or whatever. I have another person is maybe doing machine learning stuff with like really cool computer vision things. Let's say somebody else is working on a game that they're building in Unity, that sort of thing. So everybody's doing different things, but the idea is that they really kind of filter for people who are excited to share their knowledge and to like help other people learn. And so they have some guardrails in place to make sure it stays a really like safe learning environment and really encouraging.
So are there like mentors that are sort of fielding ideas or maybe doing some matchmaking for folks who are working on similar things?
Yeah, so there are some staff members, I believe they call them faculty members, but they're not necessarily, they've gone through a few different iterations. When I was there were a couple of people called facilitators that were there to do exactly that, to kind of help people along when they get stuck or to just maybe pair with somebody for a little while. But of course, you have everybody else in your, they call them batches. So everybody else in your batch is also there for, if you're looking for somebody to sort of bang your heads together on a particular problem, you say, hey, like I'm looking for somebody to pair with and usually find someone. But nowadays, I think they discontinued the concept of facilitators because it did kind of, I think they really want to underscore this idea that everyone has something to contribute. Everyone has something to teach, even if you're new, even if you're learning, like that's valuable. And as somebody who's maybe more senior, let's say pairing with somebody who's more junior, like, and I think we see this in our workplaces a lot too. You know, the more senior person is getting a lot out of it too, right? They have to work on explaining their thought processes. They have to work on breaking down assumptions. They have to work on communicating complex topics to someone who's not as well versed in all the technicalities. So the idea, I think, at the Recurse Center is that everybody is really kind of in it together and giving back and learning from each other in this kind of perpetual, everlasting motion cycle is the idea.
And how is this all funded? Or is it self-funded, or is there a grant program?
So there actually is no cost to attend.
Okay.
So it's totally free for participants. When it was in person in New York, there was, of course, a cost associated with being in New York for 6 weeks or 3 months. But at the time that I did it, when it was in New York, there was a grant program to assist with living expenses for underrepresented folks.
Okay.
So that's really cool. But the way that they make money, the way that they fund the thing is that they partner with tech companies to help find engineers for them. So if you're going through the Recurse Center, you don't have to take a job through their kind of career center, but you are welcome to use their career center if you're looking for work. And because the people that tend to go there tend to be very self-motivated, self-driven, they tend to be very kind of curious and have a lot of interest in growing and expanding their skill sets. Companies, I think, find that a really nice pool to pull from and talk to. And so they'll have things like little job fair meetups and things like that. They'll have, you know, testimonials, let's say, from other people who've interviewed at that company to give you a sense of what it's going to be like. So there's a lot of kind of emphasis for participants on the fact that they'll help you get a job in the industry if you want one. And then for companies, it's great. And I've worked at a couple of companies that have recruited from there. And it's great because you have this kind of helping hand also on that side with the Recurse Center staff helping pull people in who might be a great fit, might be interested in what you're doing, might, you know, have the right skills to fill gaps on your team, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm curious, like during your time there, did you have any sort of aha moments, or like you came in probably pretty junior because you just learned how to code for the purposes of your master's. Mm-hmm. So like, did you get to partner with other like more senior skilled folks in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I had some amazing experiences there learning from really awesome folks in the industry. For example, one of the really fun projects that I was working on, so I was learning more about programming languages and about different paradigms. So as I talk a lot about functional programming, I was learning functional programming there, but I was also just learning there's a lot of different types of programming out there, and there's a lot of different languages as opposed to Python, which I had been working in not exclusively, but largely, and kind of got really used to the way things were done in that. It was like, oh, there's all kinds of different languages out there that are possible. And so there was a computer science professor there named Prabhakar Ragde who gave a talk about the most minimal set of features a programming language would need to be productive and useful.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I was like, oh, that's really cool. And let me see if I can try. I was reading about like building your own interpreters and things. So I was like, let me see if I can try to implement a really minimal language here based on this computer science professor's talk. And while I was implementing that, there happened to be another, they had a concept of like visiting residents at the time. And so Marijn Hafabeke, who's the creator of CodeMirror and wrote the book Eloquent JavaScript. So a really great person to learn coding from, happened to be there and was like, oh, that would be fun to pair on building a programming language. So I got to pair with Marijn on like building a programming language based on Prabhakar's talk. And like, it was just a really nice kind
of
confluence. I mean, completed to the sense of like, I got the minimal set of features built. It was a toy little language. Oof, I'd have to go back and like recall everything. But it was essentially like a tiny, like Lispy language. Okay. I think it's still on my GitHub. I called it Kimi, keep it minimal, like Kimi. So you can check it out, GitHub, Vakila/Kimi. But I think it just really needed to have like some construct to make functions essentially, and some construct for, I think like basic data, in the sense of numbers or strings or something like that. But, I would have to go back and really hammer it down. I hope I wrote it all down in the README. Let's see. Let's find out.
I mean, we'll see if you get a little more stars. You might see some uptick.
I mean, it was really just a learning project. It wasn't ever a language I intended anybody to use for anything. I didn't even really use it for anything. It was really just the process of learning, like what goes into an interpreter, like what is an abstract syntax tree, like what are all of these things that are happening under the hood or behind the scenes every time I type code into my Python interpreter, that what is happening there and how can we, how can I understand that better?
So what was the result of the Recurse Center? Like, what did you take from it and like, where did you go from there?
Yeah, what did I take from it? Well, it was really interesting. It was really intense trying to kind of wrap my head around. One of my things that I was focusing there was filling in some of the gaps in my lack of computer science education. So just basic algorithms and data structures. And so doing a lot of things like interview practice and that sort of thing. So I decided I wanted to try to get into the industry. And so that is, I would say, what I took away. Not only an amazing group of people and just amazing community, which I think is the number one most important thing, period, but also just a lot of ideas and opportunities that I wasn't aware of how to continue in my career. So, for example, as I was just mentioning before we hit record, that I didn't have a Twitter account before I went to the Recurse Center. And I think it was my batchmate, Sal Becker, who was like, if you want to join the tech community, Twitter is a great place to do it, great place to find opportunities and, connect with people. And it was, and it has been great for my career. And the other big discovery was Outreachy. Yeah. So Outreachy is this amazing internship program in open source. And I didn't know it existed until I went to the Recurse Center. There were quite a few people there who had either done it or mentored for it or otherwise were involved. And so found out about it through there. I applied while I was in batch, as they say, in, I think 2015. I did not get in, was rejected.
Okay.
But learned a lot from that. And then 6 months later, after I had left the Recurse Center, Outreachy runs twice a year. So 6 months later, I applied again. And that time, I used what I had learned of how not to do it and managed to get in.
What was the insight, or what is the requirement to be part of the Outreach program?
Yeah, so Outreachy is, so first of all, it's a very cool program because it is open to pretty much anyone who's from a marginalized group in tech. It was originally called the Outreach Program for Women, so it originally was kind of more focused on women, but now I believe it's much more open. But it is for people who are traditionally underrepresented, and it's a paid remote internship. And so the way that it works is that different organizations who run big open source projects sponsor individual interns. So I interned at Mozilla. So Mozilla has a lot of open source going on, did at the time. And was sponsoring quite a few different projects. And then there are other projects in all kinds of different areas, different technologies, different languages, et cetera. But so each project will be kind of sponsored by a dedicated mentor from that organization, whether it be a company like Mozilla or some other organization that's like a nonprofit that manages open source, what have you. And so that individual project will have its own requirements of what they're looking for. Sometimes they're looking for engineering help. Sometimes they're looking for documentation or community building or product design or UX design or all kinds of different stuff. So it could be in anything, and every project is slightly different. And so what you actually need to do is going to be specific to the project. But usually it involves making an initial contribution to the project, for which you need to kind of get involved in its systems, join whatever the community place of discussion is. Yeah. Go through the process of actually contributing to this, whether it be a code base or what have you. And then you usually have to do some kind of write-up about what you would do during your time on the internship. So, what your plan would be for executing on the project that they've laid out. And ideally, they've scoped out really nicely so that it's quite approachable and it's really like kind of intern-sized in that sense. And so each application is going to look a little bit different, but essentially you have to make a contribution and describe it and describe the future work you would do and a few other things. Kind of, I think there's some essay type writing you need to do, but it's probably changed a little bit since I did it in 2016. And even then, it was very specific to the project. It was sort of different for everywhere.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it sounds like there's some commitment from the company side or the project side, but. So to show some commitment up front from the apprentice or what
the mentee, I guess you could say, or the intern. So what's nice about these internships is they all have a dedicated mentor or dedicated point of contact in the organization. And then the mentee or the intern is the person who's kind of coming in and helping out. And yes, and they do want to see that you're kind of able to find your way in at least like getting started, but they help out in the sense that they do try to break it down into the most achievable. They'll lay out, like for my project, which was an engineering project, I was working on the test automation infrastructure for testing Firefox or testing Gecko, the browser engine behind Firefox, and the project was broken down really nicely, perhaps because my mentor, Maya Friedrichowski, was also an Outreachy intern once upon a time before it went. She did an internship at Mozilla. So perhaps she understood even better than many people that it's really helpful to have super clear, specific instructions, super detailed guidelines about how to communicate, where the communication should happen, what needs to be done for this project, where to find extra information, that sort of thing. So it was really nice. That was my second time around of like the time I actually got in. The first time around, I was flailing a bit more and like looking at a bunch of different projects and kind of not sure where to start. And so it was, I was still really educational for me, even when I failed to get in, because I learned, I think I made my first GitHub PR, even though it was like a 2-line change, something like that. But I did go through the PR process and made that,
So until this point, you had to use GitHub for more discovery. You haven't actually used the PR feature then?
So I had used GitHub mostly for my own work. Like I put my like master's thesis in there, you know, and like the code projects that I was working on. So I had used it for more kind of exposing what I was doing to the rest of the world so that then I could link to it from my research papers, things like that. But I hadn't really collaborated with a lot of people on GitHub, if that makes sense. So I had just been kind of GitHubbing in a bubble, as it were, or maybe collabing like IRL, but on one commit,
so you'd asked about insights and like what you saw our website, and there's like for all the projects that are on GitHub, there's like 280 million. And there's only 200,000 that have more than 5 contributors. So that's inclusive of your projects.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's pretty common for people just to use it like Dropbox. And the collaboration piece is usually the missing feature for people to go sort of get engaged in like either a company or a project or get that aha mentorship for free, like through PR. So there's a trend happening right now where more and more startups are starting with open source first. If you check out any of the batches of YC, you'll see more and more open source companies now submitting applications to YC and getting in. Now, this is a good trend because the scale and velocity of what you can do and grow through open source is off the charts. Now at OpenSauce, we are invigorated by providing actionable insights. Insights.opensauce.pizza. It's a platform to get intelligence on your open source projects. So if you're a company and you're up and coming through either YC or you're a Series A company who's looking to get their next round of funding and grow community, we have the platform for you. If you're interested in growing your project and growing your open source community, definitely check it out and let us know what you think.
Well, what was nice was I actually, the other thing that I was using was GitHub Pages. They had launched that, I think, and I was able to then use that to kind of have a nice like landing page for my project so that then my research paper, I could be like, go here, read more, that sort of thing. And then it turned out that, I think a few years after I was working on a project about speech recognition for what are called low resource languages or under-resourced languages where we don't have bajillions of hours of recorded data that's annotated and everything, which is most of the 7,000 languages in the world don't have this much data collected on them, as opposed to the top dozen, commercially viable languages that we have all of these series.
Is that the term, commercially viable?
Well, that's not it's my term.
Okay.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah, because I mean, English is pretty prolific when it comes to coding, and I think Japanese is like one of the things that GitHub put a lot of focus in because it's one of the countries that are not English first when it comes to engineering. But it's all surprising on how many other countries are like, oh yeah, all the engineers speak English, they write in English, they code in English.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I was looking at it from kind of a more of a scientific standpoint of, if we're trying to study language, we want not just 24 languages, we want all 7,000 if we can get them, but also from a perspective of, I think, equity, just like, globally and in terms of access to technology, like speech interfaces can be a huge door opener, especially in places where literacy rates are not as high, or like digital written communication is not as easy and phone lines are easier, that sort of thing. So anyway, I digress. But the point is, I was working on a project for this. I had just put it on GitHub because Dropbox, etc. GitHub page is nice, easy. Also version control, just that, I know that it's like I can go back and find it and it's not just on my laptop if my laptop gets destroyed, the Dropbox solution. Anyway, and a couple years later, somebody who was also, I think, a master's or maybe PhD student found it and ended up extending it and doing their own research, kind of building on that. And so, if it hadn't just been sitting there in the Dropbox that is GitHub for me, perhaps they wouldn't have been able to then find it and then ultimately collaborate in kind of a long-term, longitudinal sense.
Yeah.
So I like to think that even if a repo isn't necessarily, glowing in terms of stars and activity and whatnot, you never know when somebody's going to stumble across a thing. Like the way I stumbled across a link to Hacker School at 3 a.m. one morning while deep diving on God knows what online, you never know when somebody's going to find some work that you did that you made public and they're going to be able to learn for it, or they're going to be able to do something they want to do with it, right? So,
and I don't know if the Hacker School or Recurse origin story, like whoever started that or decided to do that, it's similar to also how open source projects kind of take off, because it's somebody put like your thesis or your master's work, it's out there. So then someone's like, hey, I have a question about this. Or now my mind's like now thinking of all this new AI learning when it comes to, like, there's the conversational chat GPT that came out of OpenAI where you have to ask it questions and it responds with answers. But the question could be like, write a Python function that does this, and they will give you that. Or please explain computational language mapping in 4 or 5-year-old.
Yeah.
And they will do that. And it's pretty amazing stuff. Obviously they've been working a couple years, or at least I don't know how long they've been working on this, but fascinating stuff.
I mean, decades is one way of looking at it, but yeah.
Yeah, but that's the other thing is, like, we can now take open information through open source or just through papers that are published on the internet, and we don't have to start from zero.
Yeah.
So like you were able to learn in a program or a community or tribe. It sounds like more of a tribe since there's no like structure. But you were able to learn in this tribe of the Recurse Center.
Yeah.
To then say, okay, what do you want to learn? Do you want to try this small, like, building your own language based on this paper thing? It's like, yes, you can. And that's the beauty of open source, is like being able to discover some of these little, small niche communities that don't necessarily have to be like the Reacts and the Pythons of the world.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many really beautiful communities out there that might not be attracting a ton of attention in terms of, social media presence or otherwise like looking flashy as some of the big projects do, but are nevertheless like amazing people doing amazing work together and just having a lot of fun with it in most cases. And so it's really nice to be able to discover that. And I think like that's why the community piece is so important, because I think a lot of the time those little organic kind of serendipitous bump into somebody and say, oh, what are you working on? Oh, doing this thing, then you kind of find out more and more about what's out there and what's possible. And that's why I think it's really, I don't know, it makes me think of like the words self-taught, or when people say like I'm a self-taught developer, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, I bristle at that because I feel like none of us are really self-taught. Even if you sit in a room by yourself and you don't talk to anyone, like you're reading books, maybe somebody wrote those. You're reading people's open source commits and readmes and code comments and whatever. And somebody left that there. Somebody left that comment there. They didn't just like do the thing that made them feel icky. They left a comment about why it made them feel icky, if they're me. And that like is helping you learn. So I don't know. I think it's like, it's really all about community. And that's why it's so cool to see programs like the Recurse Center, where they really, I think everyone actually, whatever code you're working on there has to be open source. So people can't be just kind of like using that time to, I don't know, contribute back to proprietary code bases so that everybody can still learn from it. And likewise, Outreachy, right, which is really trying to make, especially for the more global, historically, marginalized and underrepresented in the tech industry population, like make it much easier to get a foot in the door in the open source community for all different walks of life. You don't have to be a computer science student, you don't have to be a coder, you can be whatever. And so I think like the more people we have in that community, the more we're going to be able to learn from each other and each other's, 6-year-old GitHub repos, whatever. And like the better off we'll all be. So
yeah. For sure. And I love the statement that honestly, to summarize what you just said, like the myth of the self-taught programmer, it truly is a myth.
Yeah, no. And I think it's much more true. Like, I don't know. I haven't heard somebody say, I'm community taught, but I think that's much more
a
true.
Little more true.
And that's,
or book taught or Stack Overflow
exactly.
taught.
Right. Yeah. So that, maybe having a self-directed path, sure, a path where you had to decide what to study and what to reach out for, but nevertheless cognizant of the fact that you're doing this not in a vacuum. We're all kind of part and parcel together. So
excellent. Well, I think we can wind down there. I did want to ask you really to summarize. You had mentioned, I don't know if it was when we hit record or not, but the open door to programming. Could you summarize that? Yeah.
So I think we were talking about, there's a talk I've given called Opening Doors with Open Source. And I sort of talk about how, my journey to tech, really the doors that opened for me were through places like the Recurse Center and Outreachy and going to open source conferences like EuroPython is where I got my first job, for example, or like things like that. The really amazing things it can do for your career when you put yourself out there, not just as a newbie trying to get into it, but also if you're trying to level up in your career, showing what you can do to future employers or what you can do for a community, that sort of thing. But also I think for companies, open source, I mean, you would, I'm sure, have tons to say about this, but like open source can open a lot of doors for like also from in a commercial sense, that we, I think, often think about them as being kind of at loggerheads or something, or there's like, I mean, there is this tension, but at the same time, it's like, no, if you have a community that's really excited about your project, even if you're, I don't know, selling the SaaS version of it or whatever it is, you're going to get more users testing it out. You're going to get more valuable feedback on it. You're going to get more more hands on deck in the sense of not just people who have the free time to be contributing back to your product, but folks who want to see something that others can benefit from succeed. And so that kind of multiplying effect gets a lot bigger when it's open up to people outside of your organization. So, that's a talk you can check out, I guess. But I think that open source is just really amazing for making things accessible, making things discoverable for folks who don't necessarily go the traditional paths. Yeah,
for sure, 100%. And I'll definitely link that. So we have I'll save explaining open source and our vision and stories, but we do have a newsletter. We'll link it below in this video, so definitely check below. And we'll also link your talk as well in there, so that way we can have more people find that story.
Thanks.
But with that, I do want to close this out. Anjana, thanks so much for coming through and having this conversation with me. And
thank you.
Opening doors for other folks in open source.
Hope so, yeah. And Outreachy applications are open twice a year, so if that sounds like something of interest, check out outreachy.org. And also the Recurse Center. I gotta plug again, Recurse Center.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for having me on. It's been great chatting.
Appreciate it. And I'll plug, like, and subscribe, and stay saucy.